On April 2nd, 1974, the most glamorous night in Hollywood was underway. The 46th Academy Awards. Actors in tuxedos, directors in the audience, millions of viewers watching across America. Host David Niven stood at the microphone preparing to introduce the next presenter. And then something happened no one expected. A completely naked man suddenly sprinted across the stage behind him. He flashed a peace sign toward the crowd and disappeared backstage. For a moment, the ceremony froze. The audience gasped. And then they started laughing. Lasted only a few seconds. But that moment became one of the most famous interruptions in television history. The man responsible was Robert Opel. Most people remember the stunt, but almost no one knows the rest of the story, because Robert Opel wasn't just a prankster. He was a political speechwriter, an activist, a photographer, a gallery owner, and someone who believed that shocking public performances could force society to confront uncomfortable ideas. And the strange truth is, his life after the Oscars was even more bizarre than the stunt that made him famous. So, tonight on Deep Frontier, we're exploring the forgotten story of the man who streaked across the Oscars and what really happened to him afterward. The Oscars have produced many unforgettable moments: political speeches, shocking wins, and the occasional onstage meltdown. But very few moments have become as legendary as the 1974 Oscar streaking incident. Even decades later, the clip still appears in lists of the most shocking live television moments. But the story behind it is far stranger than most people realize, because the man who ran across that stage wasn't just seeking attention. He was part of a much larger cultural moment happening in America in the early 1970s. A moment shaped by protest movements, radical art, and a bizarre national fad that briefly swept across the country. To understand how the Oscar streak happened, we have to start long before that night, with the life of Robert Opel. Robert Opel was born October 23, 1939, in East Orange, New Jersey. His birth name was Robert Opel, spelled with two P's. Later in life, he intentionally removed one letter from his last name.
Did this because he worried his controversial activism might embarrass his family.
His family moved frequently during his childhood. At different times, they lived in Canada, Kansas, Kentucky.
Eventually settling in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where Opel attended school and college.
Even as a student, he had a reputation for speaking his mind.
He served in student government and led debate teams, showing an early talent for public argument and persuasion.
Those skills would eventually lead him into politics. After college, Opel briefly entered the world of political campaigns.
An unexpected twist, he worked as a speechwriter for California Governor Ronald Reagan earlier in his career.
But the political environment of the 1960s was chaotic. Civil rights protests were reshaping American culture. The Vietnam War was dividing the country. Young activists were challenging traditional ideas about authority and morality. And Opel himself began moving away from mainstream politics.
By the early 1970s, he had become deeply involved in counterculture activism and gay liberation movements.
He also worked as a freelance photographer, an editor and contributor for LGBTQ publications, and a teacher of English as a second language in Los Angeles. But Opel was also developing a reputation for unusual forms of protest. He believed that shock and spectacle could draw attention to social issues, and sometimes his demonstrations involved nudity.
At one point, he appeared naked in Los Angeles City Council meetings to protest laws banning public nudity on beaches.
He even created a costume called Mr. Penis to satirize censorship laws. To Opel, these performances weren't jokes, they were political theater. By 1973 and 1974, America had developed a bizarre cultural obsession. Streaking. College students began running naked across campuses. Then it spread to football games, concerts, public parks, and even television broadcasts.
The trend became so popular that the novelty song called The Streak by Ray Stevens reached #1 on the music charts.
Sociologists later described streaking as one of the strangest short lived fads in American history. It appeared almost overnight and disappeared almost as quickly. Robert Opel saw something different in it. To him, streaking was a form of performance art, and if it happened in the right place, it could become a cultural statement. He began planning a stunt that would unfold on the most famous stage in Hollywood. Hold on, I'm fixing.
The 46th Academy Awards was held at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in Los Angeles.
Security was far less strict in 1974 than it is today. There were no modern ID scanners or metal detectors. Opel took advantage of this. He arrived dressed as a journalist, carrying a camera. Using a press credential, he managed to gain access backstage. Once inside, he waited near the stage.
Some reports suggest he even cut through part of a curtain to reach the right position behind the set.
Then he waited for the perfect moment. David Niven was introducing Elizabeth Taylor to present the Best Picture award. Suddenly, Opal stepped out from behind the curtain. Completely naked, he sprinted across the stage, flashing a peace sign toward the audience. The stunt lasted only a few seconds, but millions of viewers saw it live. Niven paused, then delivered one of the most famous Oscar jokes ever.
Isn't it fascinating to think that probably the only laugh that man will ever get in his life is by stripping off and showing his shortcomings?
The audience erupted with laughter, and just like that, Robert Opel became famous. Almost immediately, rumors began circulating. Had the stunt been planned? Some insiders later claimed that Oscar producer Jack Haley Jr. may have known about the stunt in advance. Others said David Niven seemed unusually prepared with his famous response.
Even members of the production staff speculate the moment might have been orchestrated.
But no definitive proof ever emerged. Opel himself always insisted that the streak was his own idea. Whether it was spontaneous or secretly planned, the moment became instantly one of the most memorable in Oscar history. He appeared on television talk shows, he gave interviews to newspapers around the world. For a few months, he was one of the most recognizable pranksters in America. But Opel didn't want to remain famous for streaking. Instead, he returned to art. He worked as a photographer for LGBTQ publications, including The Advocate. He photographed activists, artists, and performers from the underground art scene. Then in 1978, he opened a photography gallery in San Francisco called Fei Wei Studios. The gallery became known for showcasing bold and provocative photography. It also featured work by rising artists, including Robert Mapplethorpe, who would later become famous for controversial images that sparked debates about censorship. Opel also became involved in activism again.
In 1976, he even announced a satirical campaign for president of the United States using the slogan, "Nothing to hide."
It was classic Opel, part politics, part performance art. On July 7th, 1979, Robert Opel was working at his San Francisco gallery. Two men entered the building. They attempted to rob the gallery. During the confrontation, Opel was unfortunately shot and killed.
He was only 39 years old.
Two suspects were later convicted and sentenced to prison. The murder shocked the local art community. But outside San Francisco, the story barely made headlines. Within a few years, Robert Opel had largely faded from public memory. Today, the footage of the 1974 streak is still replayed in Oscar retrospectives. But the man behind the moment was far more complex than the stunt itself. He had been a political speechwriter, an activist, a photographer, a gallery owner, and a provocateur who believed public performance could challenge cultural norms. History remembers him as a streaker. The reality is that Robert Opel spent much of his life pushing boundaries, long before he ran across the Oscar stage. History tends to reduce people to a single moment. For Robert Opel, that moment lasted less than 10 seconds. But the life surrounding it was far more unusual. From politics to protest, from photography to performance art, his story reflects a strange moment in American culture when rebellion, humor, and activism collided in unexpected ways. And sometimes, the moments that seem the most absurd at first glance turn out to reveal something deeper about the era that produced them.